Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, you're going to learn how to create a dark mode toggle for a React application. Now, in this video specifically, we're going to be using Gatsby.js, which is a React.js framework. Now, it's worth mentioning that I'm not going to talk about how to set up your local environment for Gatsby.js, but I'll be sure to include a link in the description so you can go ahead and follow that and ensure your local machine is ready to start building sites with Gatsby. So once you have that and you're ready to go with Gatsby, let's go ahead and jump in to our terminal and create our project. And the first thing we want to do in the terminal is to go ahead and head to the spot where we want to create our project. In this case, I'm going to head into the documents and I'm going to head into a folder here that I have for SkillThrive. Now, once I'm here, I'm going to run a command that's going to use Gatsby in order to create our project. Now, we're going to be using a repo called Gatsby Starter Hello World, which is the most basic starter for Gatsby. And I like using this one just so I have all the bare essentials to get started without any extra code that I'm just not going to end up using in my project. So to do that, we can write Gatsby new dark mode. And dark mode is just the name of the project. That's what I'm giving it. You can call it whatever you want. And then we need to use the URL of where the project is. So I'm just going to copy this, then come back in and then paste that and then hit enter. And it's going to go ahead and create our project here. Now it shouldn't take too long because it is such a simple Gatsby project. And once that's done, we'll go into that. We'll open it up into VS Code, which is the code editor that I want to be using. All right, so once that's done, let's go ahead and head into that new project. So we called that CD dark mode. So change directory to the dark mode. And now what I want to do is I want to run the command code and then a period. Now this won't work if you're not using VS Code. And if you are using VS Code, you have to make sure that you have this set up to accept this code shortcut. And I'll link a description in the video if you want to go ahead and make sure you have that set up. So once you have that, hit code, period, and then it's going to open up our project here and VS Code. So let's go ahead and just maximize this screen. Get rid of this welcome here. And the first thing we want to do is you just want to go ahead and install some dependencies. Now, in order to do that, we're just going to go ahead and hit Control and then this back tick, and that's going to open the terminal here in VS Code. And what we want to do is first run npm I, so npm install. And the first one we're going to do is emotion /core, then emotion -theming. Then we want the Gatsby plugin -emotion, and we want local -storage -fallback. And I'm just gonna make sure I have spelled everything correctly and everything looks good. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And let's go ahead and I'm gonna jump forward into the video once all these dependencies are done installing. All right, so once that's done, I'm just gonna clear the terminal. Then I'm gonna come into my package.json file here. And let's just make sure that the dependencies are here. So you can see emotion core, emotion theming. We have our Gatsby plugin emotion and our local storage fallback. All right, so once we have that, let's go ahead and just boot it up so we can actually see our project. And you can see here in this scripts here under our package.json, in order to initialize our development environment, we can run npm run build. So we don't want to run a Gatsby, or excuse me, npm run build. We want to run npm run develop. And then that's going to actually initialize the local development server for us. All right, so now we can see that we have localhost 8000 running our site, as well as this graphical interface, which is really useful if you're using Gatsby to pull in content from, like a GraphQL API. But we won't talk about that now. Let's go ahead and just open up this localhost 8000. And we'll head into Chrome here. If we can actually get it open. There we go. So let's do localhost 8000, and there we go. We can see our Hello World project. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to add the plugin to our Gatsby config, and specifically the Gatsby plugin emotion. And this is going to ensure that we can use the emotion package in our Gatsby project. So what we want to do is head back to our code here. Go ahead and just close this up and head into our Gatsby config file. Now right here on our module exports, we want to write plugins and then an array here of the plugins we want to initialize, which is the Gatsby plugin emotion. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And that's all we need to do in our Gatsby config. I'm just going to delete this comment. All right, and the next thing we want to do is we want to create our global store. Now we're going to be using React hooks in order to do this, specifically the useContext and useReducer hooks. And in order to get started, let's go ahead and just create our context first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into source, create a new folder here, and just call this store. Then I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this context.js. And first thing we want to do is we want to import create context, and we want to import that from React. Okay. Now, if you don't know what context is, essentially the way you can pass data around in components with React is using props. Now, let's say, for instance, you have nested props. So you would have to, in that instance, if you're using props, pass one prop down to one component and then the next and the next. And this is called prop drilling. And this is really cumbersome. It's hard to understand what's kind of how you're passing this data around. And there's a way better way of doing that, and that is with context. So the way we can initialize this is first creating a constant called context, and then we just call create context, and we're going to pass in an empty object here. And then what we want to do is we want to export this. So export default context, and that's it. All right, so we created the context. Next thing we want to do is we want to create a use global state React hook, a custom React hook. And to do that, we first need to create the file. So let's come back here to our store, create a new file, and we'll call this use global state.js. And notice how I kind of had the same convention on how the rest of React hooks are named. So it's usually undercase use and then whatever it is. So use state, use context, use effect. So let's go ahead and create that. And here we want to import useReducer from React. Whoops. useReducer, I'll eventually get it. And that's going to be from React. Okay. Now you might be wondering, hey, why aren't we just using useState? Why are we using useReducer? And that's a great question. We can actually use useState if we want to, but I would really suggest using useReducer because I'm assuming your project's going to get more complicated and you might have values that hold arrays or objects, and it would just be a little too cumbersome and error prone to be updating the state using useState. Now, I'm not going to go into the full details of why that is. I'm going to link to a description below from a guy. I read his stuff all the time. I think his name's Wybick. I'm sorry if I'm forgetting that or mispronouncing it. But he has a great write-up about why you'd want to use useState over useReducer. Now that we said that, let's go ahead, and the first thing we want to do is define our state value here, or excuse me, our hook. So that's going to be use global state. And this is going to be an arrow function. And in here, we want to go ahead and call useReducer. So that's going to be similar to how we do useState. We're going to be using array destructuring. The first value is the name of our state. And then here we can pass in dispatch. Now dispatch is what we're going to call on an action type in order to do something to the state. Now that's going to make a lot more sense here in just a few minutes, but let's go ahead now and initialize the useReducer. Did that again. And that useReducer is going to take in a couple arguments as well. The first one is the reducer, which we still have not defined yet. And this reducer is going to take in an action, and then it's going to look at the type of action that we passed in and decide what it wants to do with the state based off of what that action type is. So the next thing we can pass in here is our initial state values. And in here, it's just going to be an object. And the first one is going to be isDark. Actually, the only one we're going to be doing in this tutorial is a value called isDark, and we'll set that to a default of false. All right, so once we have that, we want to return something so we can actually read this once we use this as a hook. And what we want to return here is the state and dispatch. All right, and now we need to export this so we can use it elsewhere. So export default use global state. And now, once we save that, we still need to define what this reducer is. And I'm going to do that outside of where we define the hook here. So let's go ahead now and call const reducer. And if you're looking at this, like, this sounds familiar, what's going on here? And it might be because you've tried to, or you've learned, or you already know Redux. And this is a similar pattern on using Redux, where we use reducers and action types and switch statements to define the action types. And that's why we're using that same pattern as we would in Redux. So here, this is going to be another arrow function. And it's going to take in the state value. And this state value is referring to the state down here that we initialized when we called this use global state, or when we created it. And then it's going to take an action. Now, similar to what you would do in Redux, you would create a switch statement, which is going to look at the action type. And based off of what that action type is, it's going to do different things. So let's go ahead and set the first case here to toggle dark mode. Now, you don't have to write it like this. This is just a convention. And here we're just going to, for now, just return an empty object. And remember, with a case, a switch statement, excuse me, we want to also define a default value. So the default here is just going to return the state. So return state. All right, so now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and save that. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create our global state provider. And what this is going to do, it's going to wrap around our application, and it's going to allow us to read off of it and use it and pass it down into children components. So now what we want to do is go ahead and create a new file called global state provider. So let's go ahead and do that. And convention is just all caps, so global state provider.js. And the first thing we want to do in here is import React from React. Then we want to import the hook that we just created. So use global state. And that's going to be from the same directory, but from use global state. And the next thing we want to do is import the context as well. So that's going to be from the same here. Okay. So now what we want to do is create a new constant called global state provider. Global state provider. This is going to be an arrow function. And in here, we're going to destructure something called children. And what this is going to allow us to do is whatever we wrap this provider between, the children says whatever is wrapped in between there, go ahead and render that out as well. So let's go ahead now and create the arrow function. And in here, we want to return the context provider. So let's go ahead here and we can say context. And that context is referring to the one that we imported. Then we can say provider. Then we need to pass in a value. And the value that we're going to pass in is the hook. So global use global state. Then we go ahead and close this off. And we can pass in the children in between here. So children. the next thing we want to do is go ahead and export default global state provider. Now we're getting an error here because of this typo. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to wrap this global state provider around our application. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the video that this is a little bit different in Gatsby.js because Gatsby is going to build our app and then rehydrate it as a React.js application. So what we want to do is we want to use the browser API that comes with Gatsby, and we're going to use an API property called wrap root element. And where you actually write that is in a file called Gatsby-browser.js and Gatsby-ssr.js. Now, you might notice that we don't have those files, so let's go ahead and create them. And that's going to be Gatsby-browser.js and Gatsby-ssr.js. So let's go into our browser file here. And the first thing we want to do is go ahead and import React. And we want to import that global state provider that we just created. So global state provider. And that's going to be from the source here, the store, and then global state provider. Okay, and then here we want to use that wrap root element here. So export const wrap root element, and this is going to take in a value called element, which we're going to do structure. And this is kind of similar to children, but this is going to essentially do something a little bit different, where it's going to essentially wrap our app where we pass in the element. So it's going to be an arrow function. And let's go ahead and do the global state provider here. And in between here is where we call element. So let's go ahead and save that. And it looks like I'm getting an error here because this store isn't actually in our source. So let's make sure we add that. And let's go ahead and delete that and save it and see if that. So we're still getting something kind of weird here. I'm not really sure what's going on. Oh, that's because I need to explicitly return this. So instead of wrapping around the curly brackets, because we're not using a return statement, we'd write it like this. Okay. So that should fix that problem now. Now, actually, now that we're wrapping this app, let's go into our project here in our local host where it's being hosted. And I'm going to be using the React components Chrome tools here. So we'll come into inspect. And it's going to show you the tool I'm using or referring to. So React Chrome Dev Tools. So it's this one, React Developer Tools. So you want to make sure you have this installed. And it just gives you some really nice tools to look at your React components. All right, so now that we have that, if we come up and we actually don't have it right now, that's because we need to rerun the app because we didn't have the Gatsby config files, the browser and SSR files. So let's go ahead and kill our server here. And let's go ahead and run npm run develop again. All right, so that just rebuilt the app. Let's go back into our project here and refresh it. There we go. Now we can see our global state provider here, and we can see this hooks, which has this reducer where we have this value, this state value called is dark to false. All right, so now we have everything essentially set up with our global provider here. Let's go ahead now and move on to the next phase of this tutorial where we're going to be defining our theme. So let's go back into our project here. And in the source folder, let's create a new folder and call this theme. And in here, we'll create another file and we'll call this theme.js. And in here, we're just going to export a constant that's going to have some theme values. And the reason we're doing this is so we can just import it, and it just kind of keeps our code a little cleaner. So let's go ahead and export a const called theme. And this is going to be an object. And the first value is going to be an object called light, which is going to be an object as well, which is going to have a value of font equal to black. And the black is what the CSS value is going to be. So the next thing we want to do is define our background color for our light value, which is just going to be white. And here we can create another value called dark. And we can do the same thing. So font here is just going to be the opposite. So white, and the background color for our dark mode is going to be black. All right, so if we save that, that's everything for that file. Let's just go ahead and close that out. And the next thing we want to do is we want to also wrap our app around with a theme provider. And this theme provider is going to be given to us from the emotion theming package that we installed at the beginning of this video. So what we need to do is head back into our Gatsby browser here. And at the top, we need to go ahead and import that here. So we want to import theme provider. And that's going to be from emotion theming. And we also want to go ahead and import that theme that we just created. So import theme, and that's going to be from the source file, theme, and then theme as well. Let's go ahead and save that. And just like before, we want to wrap this around. Now I'm actually going to wrap this inside our global state provider so our theme provider can read off of that. So let's do theme provider, and this takes in a prop called theme, and we're just going to pass in the theme that we imported at the top. And let's just go ahead and cut this out, and then make sure we wrap it here, and then just go ahead and save that. All right, so no errors, that's good. All right, so now we have a theme provider here. Let's go ahead and check out our application. So now you can see that we have this theme provider, which has this state of theme, dark, and then the values that we passed in. So now we can read off that theme the same way that we can read off our global state. All right, and one thing I'm not sure I did is to make sure we also copy this Gatsby browser code into our Gatsby SSR file as well. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is I'm going to create a layout component that I'm going to wrap around our page. And what that's going to do is essentially hold our global styles. And that's important because let's say, for instance, we wanted to style the body. We can first define it in that layout component and then wrap it with in our page. And then all the components that are nested in it are going to refer to that global style. So what we want to do here is first in our source file, I'm going to create a folder called components. We create a new file here and we call this layout.js. And in this file, we want to import React, and we also want to import use context. And use context is how we're going to read the global state. So let's go ahead and import that from React. We also want to import a global component, and that's going to come from emotion. And we also want to import the CSS so we can write the styling the way emotion wants us to. And that's going to be from @emotion_core. Then we want to import the use theme hook, which is given to us from the emotion themings package. And then we want to last import the context that we created at the beginning of the video. And that's going to be one up, and that's going to be in store, and then context. All right, so we have everything imported. Let's go ahead now and create a function component here that we'll call layout. And this is going to have children as well, because we're going to render things in between this. Go ahead and write our component here. And the first thing we want to do is we want to read the state off of the use context React hook. So we can say state, and we're going to say use context. And the context we want to read off of is the context that we created. Cool. So now that we have that, we can read off the state value. And the next constant I want to create is one for the theme. So that's going to be const theme equals use theme. Go ahead and call that here. And then we can go ahead and write our return. So this return is going to have a div. And in here, I'm going to then create the global component. And in here is where we can define our global styles. So let's just go ahead and scroll down a little bit. And the way we do that is first writing styles equals, and then do a backtick CSS, which is the other thing we imported from Emotion. And the first thing I want to do is just set some resets here. So let's go ahead and set box sizing to border box, set margin to 0, and set padding to 0 as well. And then what we want to do is we want to add some stylings to the body. And that's going to be the background color is what we want to change. And here is where we can actually start to set the CSS value depending on what the value is in the state. And the way we do this is using a template literal, and then we're going to pass a ternary operator into this template literal. So we say state, so we're reading off the state, and then the value we want to read off of is dark. And we're going to say, hey, is dark true? And if it is, we want to use the dark background color. And we can read that off of theme dark background. And if it's not, we want to use the theme light. Whoops, I'll eventually get it here. Light background. So let's go ahead and save that. And we need to make sure we pass in the children here. So children. And I also need to make sure I close that global component. All right, so once we save that, we now have our global styles. And the next thing we want to do is move on to our index page. Now, similar to like in PHP, the way Gatsby handles pages and creating pages is here in this pages folder under the source folder. So we come over and open this index here. This is essentially the code that we're seeing once we land on our home page. And what I want to do is just go ahead and just get rid of this export default here, and just go ahead and import everything we need and actually write what we want to display here on our index page. And the first thing we want to import is CSS, and that's going to be coming from at Emotion. So at Emotion core. We want to import actually let's go ahead and just copy this from the layout. So that's going to be the use theme, and we need the context as well. Let's paste that in. And let's make sure, so emotion theme, yeah, that's going to be the store context is the same. And we also want to import the layout component that we just created. So that's going to be from components and then layout. Okay. So let's go ahead and create another function component. So const, call this index page. And again, it's going to be an arrow function. It's not going to take any props. And in here, we're going to read off the context again. Now we also, we need to read off the state, or we need access to the state. And we also need access to something called dispatch, which we were going to call in order to change the state. So let's do const. We need state and we need dispatch. And again, we just say use context. Whoops. And the context we want access to is the context that we imported at top. And again, we want to do the same thing for theme. And that's going to be use theme. Okay. And down here, we want our return. And I'm going to first wrap everything in a layout component. And the reason we do that is because we want everything beneath it to have those global styles that we just created. Then we're creating a div. And in this div, it's really simple. We're just going to have an h1. H1 is going to say hello world. And then we're going to have a button, which we're going to use to toggle the state. And this is just going to say toggle dark mode. So toggle dark mode. And on click, we want to call an arrow function that's going to dispatch an action type, which we still need to create all that in just a few minutes. So that's going to say on click, it's going to be an arrow function, and it's going to dispatch an action. And that action is going to have a type of toggle underscore dark underscore mode. Let's go ahead and make sure that looks right. Okay. And underneath this, I'm just going to create an h2 tag. And in here, we can say dark mode is, and then we can say, hey, what is the state value? So state is dark mode. Is that true? If it is, we can say on. And if it's not, we can say it's off. So dark mode is off. And all right, so let's go ahead and save that. And we need to make sure too, we export the index page. So export default index page. Okay, so now what we want to do is add some styling here, and we're going to be reading off this theme value to do that, and using emotion to add the styles. So just like before, we can say the CSS prop, and the way we call it is here with the backticks, with the CSS in front, and then we can just write our, plain old CSS right here. And just like CSS, we can actually, we can call or add styles to the children of elements. So for instance, the div here has children of h1, button, and h2. And we can style those right here in the parent. So we can say h1, comma, h2. And then we can pass styles here. And the one we want to set is color. And just like before, we want to write a template literal here that looks at the state and then sets the value accordingly. So let's go ahead and write our template literal. And that's going to look at state is dark. So if that's true, we want to use theme dark font. If it's not, we want to do theme light font. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And let's go ahead back to our app here and see if we get any errors. We do. Use context is not defined. So what do we use? Use context up here, and we need to make sure we import that from React. So use context. All right. So the error should go away, and you see nothing changes, which is what we want, right? Because by default, dark mode is off. Now let's go ahead and go into our use global state. And let's say we wanted to change this to true. Or actually, let's not do that. Let's head into our theme and change the value there. So we can say red. So now the text, whoops. So we're getting an error here from our index for some reason. So index. So we're getting an error here, and it looks like export default imported as layout was not found in components layout. So let's go ahead and come up here. And that's because we did not export this. So export default layout. So it's going to save that. Refresh our page. Cool. So now you can see, because we changed that theme, the font for the light theme to red, now it's rendering as red. So we know this is working. So let's come back and come into our theme here. So theme.js and change that back to what it was before, which was black, and then save that. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create that dispatch function in our use global state in order to change and toggle that dark mode. So let's go back into our use global state. So use global state. And here we have the toggle dark mode, and inside this return, we want to say is dark. So this is the state we want to change, and we want to set it to the current state, but we want to set it to the opposite of what the current state is, which is going to give us that toggle functionality. So let's go ahead and do that and save it. And now what we want to do is come back. And there we go. Now we have our dark mode. But now if we refresh this, it reverts back to the original value, which is kind of lame, right? Let's say, for instance, you were on a website, you liked it on dark mode, and then you had to toggle that every time you went back to the site. That would be really lame. So one way we could handle that is to store the value in local storage. Then if that value exists, we'll use that value as the default. And if it's not, we'll have that fallback to what we have now. So in order to take care of that, we want to come into our use state here. And we want to import storage from one of the other dependencies we added, which is the local storage fallback. Now you could just add this to local storage, but I really like the local storage fallback because this ensures for whether it's someone's browsing on a certain browser doesn't have local storage, or it's private browsing, it's going to find a fallback for local storage if something can't actually be written to it. And what we want to do here is, in this case, we want to say storage set item, and we want to set the value here in local storage is dark, and we want to set it to the opposite of what the current state value is. Okay, so let's come back into our app here, come into inspect, down to application. Let's go ahead and just clear this out, refresh this. So once we click on this, we should see a local storage value being added. So let's see that. So is dark mode true? Cool. So we can see now that local storage value is toggling as well. So how do we read off of that? Well, remember, the way we initiated the default value is here where we call the use global state and the useReducer. So what we can do is we can just do another ternary operator and see if that value exists in local storage, and then we can set it to that, and if it isn't, we can have the default of false. Okay, so let's go ahead and just write that. So what we can do is say storage get item, and the item we want to get is dark. So we're saying, hey, does that value exist? And if it does, let's go ahead and parse that value and then use it as our state. So to parse it, we say json.parse, and what we want to parse is storage get item, and then the is dark value is dark. And if that is false, if it does not exist, what we want to do is we want to just have a fallback here of false. Cool. So let's go ahead and save that. And we're getting an error here because I wrote this wrong. So that's a question mark and then colon for the if it's false. Okay. So now let's go ahead and clear this out. Now, once we click dark mode and refresh this, it's reading off of what we have in local storage. And just to make sure that works, we can go into a new tab, paste it in, and there you go. So I know it was a lot of work to get the global state and theme set up, but now you should have a solid foundation for building your app and your theme. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other tutorials on skillthrive.com and on our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive. and I'll see you in the next one.